The December cold bit through Private Samuel Hartley's wool coat like teeth through paper. He stood outside the stone barracks in Mankato, Minnesota, his breath forming ghostly clouds that dissolved into the gray afternoon. The musket felt heavier than usual in his gloved hands, not from its weight, but from what it represented. Inside those walls, 38 Dakota men sat shackled, waiting for a death that would come with the dawn. Samuel was 22 years old, a farmer's son from Pennsylvania who'd enlisted believing in the righteousness of preserving the Union. He'd expected to fight Confederates, not guard condemned Indians. Yet here he stood, assigned to watch over men who would die not on a battlefield, but on a scaffold built specifically for their execution. The barracks had been a storage facility before the war, a long, narrow building with stone walls and iron-barred windows. Now it housed the condemned, men who'd been part of the Dakota War that had torn through southwestern Minnesota just months earlier. The conflict had been brutal. Settlers murdered in their homes, farms burned, families scattered. Samuel had heard the stories from survivors. Children scalped, women taken, bodies left in fields for the crows. The rage in Mankato was palpable, a living thing that prowled the streets and gathered in saloons where men drank and spoke of vengeance. But Samuel had also heard other stories, whispered by older soldiers who'd been in Minnesota longer. Stories of treaty violations, of food withheld, of government agents growing fat while Dakota families starved. Stories of a people pushed beyond desperation into violence. He didn't know what to believe anymore. He pushed open the heavy wooden door and stepped inside. The smell hit him first. Unwashed bodies, fear, and something else he couldn't name. The interior was dimly lit by oil lamps hung from the ceiling. Along both walls, the prisoners sat in rows, their ankles shackled to iron bars that ran the length of the building. Some sat with their backs against the cold stone, others huddled forward with their heads between their knees. A few spoke in low voices in their Dakota tongue, words Samuel couldn't understand but whose tone he recognized, resignation mixed with defiance. Captain Redmond stood near the entrance, his weathered face expressionless. He was a career soldier, 45 years old, with grey in his beard and eyes that had seen too much to be moved by sentiment. "Hartley," he said without preamble, "you're on watch until midnight. No talking to the prisoners, no passing them anything. They get water and nothing else. Understand?" "Yes, sir," Samuel replied, standing straighter. Redmond studied him for a moment. "This bothering you, Private?" Samuel hesitated. Honesty seemed dangerous, but lying felt worse. "I'm just doing my duty, sir." "That's not what I asked." Samuel met his gaze. "I don't know what bothers me anymore, sir. I just know I'll follow orders." Redmond's expression softened slightly, though not enough to be called sympathy. "Good answer. Stay alert. Some of these men are warriors. They might try something desperate before morning." The captain left, his boots echoing against the stone floor. Samuel positioned himself near the center of the room, where he could observe both ends of the barracks. The prisoners paid him little attention. Most seemed lost in their own thoughts, their faces marked by exhaustion and something deeper, a kind of grief that transcended language. One man sat apart from the others, not in isolation, but in a space that seemed to form naturally around him. He was older than most, perhaps 50, with long, grey-streaked hair and a face carved by weather and wisdom. Unlike the others, who wore whatever remnants of clothing they'd been captured in, this man wore a simple buckskin shirt despite the cold. His eyes were closed, and his lips moved in silent prayer or song. Samuel had been briefed about him. Wikangpi, the name meant star in Dakota. He was a spiritual leader, a man who'd counseled peace even as younger warriors prepared for war. He'd never raised a weapon, never killed a settler, but he'd been condemned alongside the others. The military tribunal had been swift, often lasting mere minutes per man. Guilt by association, by presence, by simply being Dakota during a time of war. As the hours passed, Samuel watched the prisoners with growing discomfort. They were men, he realized, not the monsters he'd been taught to imagine. They spoke softly to one another, shared what little water they had, comforted those who wept. One young man, barely 18, sat trembling with his head against the wall. An older prisoner beside him placed a shackled hand on his shoulder, speaking in low, steady tones that seemed to calm him. The young man's name was Changtewashtewing, Good Heart, though Samuel would never learn this. He'd been a hunter, not a warrior, caught near a burned farmstead with no weapon and no blood on his hands. His testimony, given through a translator who spoke imperfect Dakota, had been confused and contradictory. The tribunal had taken 8 minutes to condemn him. Samuel noticed another prisoner, a man with a scar running down his left cheek, who sat perfectly still, his eyes open but unfocused. This was Tatanka Nazing, Standing Buffalo, a warrior who'd fought at Birch Coulee and New Ulm. Unlike Wikangpi and Changtewashtewing, Standing Buffalo had killed settlers. He'd done so believing he was defending his people's land, protecting children and elders from starvation as government rations went mysteriously missing. He didn't regret his actions, but he regretted the necessity of them, regretted that the world had become a place where such choices were required. Near midnight, Wikangpi opened his eyes and looked directly at Samuel. The intensity of that gaze made the young soldier shift uncomfortably. The Dakota elder didn't speak, didn't gesture, but something passed between them, a recognition perhaps that they were both trapped in a moment neither had chosen. Samuel broke the gaze first, looking away, his heart pounding for reasons he couldn't name. He thought of his childhood, of running through Pennsylvania fields with his brothers, of his mother's voice calling them home for supper. He thought of the simplicity of that life, before he understood that the world was built on such foundations of violence and sorrow. The oil lamps flickered, casting dancing shadows on the stone walls. Outside, the wind had picked up, howling around the barracks like the voices of all the dead demanding to be heard. Samuel pulled his coat tighter and tried to focus on his duty, on the simple act of standing guard, of maintaining order in a world that felt increasingly disordered. But his eyes kept returning to the prisoners, to their quiet dignity in the face of approaching death. These were not the savages he'd been warned about, the inhuman creatures who deserved no mercy. These were fathers and sons, brothers and uncles, men with histories and hopes that would end tomorrow at 10 o'clock in the morning when the trapdoors fell. The cold deepened as the night progressed. Samuel's relief came at midnight. A gruff sergeant named Morris, who smelled of whiskey and tobacco. Samuel stepped outside into the frozen darkness, grateful for the excuse to leave the barracks' oppressive atmosphere. The stars overhead were brilliant and indifferent, scattered across the Minnesota sky like salt spilled on black cloth. He made his way to the soldiers' quarters, a heated building near the town square where off-duty guards could rest. Inside, several men sat around a wood stove, playing cards and talking in low voices. Samuel recognized most of them, young men like himself, far from home, caught in circumstances that felt increasingly surreal. "How were they?" asked Private Miller, a stocky boy from Ohio who'd been Samuel's tentmate during training. "Quiet," Samuel replied, pouring himself coffee from a pot on the stove. "Just waiting." "Good," Miller said, laying down a card. "Let them wait. Let them think about what they did." "You think they're all guilty?" Samuel asked, before he could stop himself. The room went quiet. Miller looked up, his expression hardening. "My cousin lived near Sacred Heart Creek. The Indians killed her whole family. Her 2 daughters were 8 and 6 years old, found them in the yard with their skulls crushed. So, yes, I think they're guilty. Every last one of them." Samuel said nothing. He'd learned that arguing accomplished nothing. Men saw what they needed to see, believed what they needed to believe to make sense of senseless things. Miller's anger was real, born of genuine loss and grief. But so was the desperation that had driven the Dakota to violence, the starvation that had killed their children while government agents sold their treaty rations for personal profit. "The execution's at 10 tomorrow morning," said Corporal Hayes, an older soldier who rarely spoke. They've built the scaffold in the square, biggest one ever constructed in America, they say. Can hang all 38 at once. Efficient, someone muttered. Hayes continued, his voice measured. President Lincoln reviewed the cases himself. Originally, they'd condemned 303 Dakota to death. Lincoln reduced it to 39, then 38, after one man received a last-minute reprieve. Some folks here think Lincoln's too soft, that all 300 should swing. Should have been all 300, Miller said bitterly. Should have been every Dakota in Minnesota. Hayes looked at him steadily. That would be genocide, Private, not justice. Call it what you want. My cousin's daughters are still dead. The conversation drifted to other topics. The progress of the war back east, rumors of Confederate movements, speculation about when the fighting would end. But Samuel couldn't focus. He finished his coffee and lay down on his bunk, staring at the ceiling beams. Sleep wouldn't come. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Wikangapi's face, those eyes that seemed to look not at him, but through him, seeing something Samuel himself couldn't yet recognize. He thought about the trials, about how swiftly justice had been dispensed. Most of the condemned had been tried in groups, with testimony given through translators who often misunderstood the questions and answers. Evidence was sparse, often consisting of little more than someone claiming they'd seen a particular Dakota man near a scene of violence. There'd been no defense attorneys, no time for investigation, no presumption of innocence. The military commission had processed hundreds of cases in a matter of weeks, driven by the townspeople's demand for vengeance and the government's need to be seen as acting decisively. Samuel wondered how many of the 38 were actually guilty of the crimes charged against them. Some, certainly, men like Standing Buffalo, who'd fought openly and admitted their actions. But others, Wikangpi, who'd never raised a weapon, Changtewashteving, who'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time. How many were being executed not for what they'd done, but for what they represented, a people who dared to resist their own erasure. When dawn broke grey and reluctant over Mankato, Samuel was already awake. He dressed in his uniform, checked his rifle, and joined the other soldiers assembling in the square. Townspeople had begun gathering despite the early hour, men, women, even children bundled against the cold, come to witness what many considered justice and others recognized as something darker. The scaffold dominated the square, a massive wooden platform with 38 nooses hanging in neat rows. It had been constructed with grim efficiency, tested and retested to ensure it would function properly. The trapdoors were controlled by a single lever, allowing all 38 men to drop simultaneously. It was, as Hayes had said, efficient. It was also monstrous in its scale, a physical manifestation of industrial death-dealing that would have been unimaginable a generation earlier. Samuel studied the crowd as more people arrived. He saw satisfaction on some faces, grim determination on others, but he also saw uncertainty, discomfort, even shame. Not everyone had come to celebrate. Some had come because they felt obligated, because the town expected their presence. Others had come out of a darker curiosity, wanting to witness history even if that history was terrible. Women in bonnets stood beside their husbands, their expressions unreadable. Children peered between adults' legs, sensing the gravity of the moment without fully understanding it. Old men who'd fought in earlier conflicts stood with their hands clasped behind their backs, their faces carved by weather and memory. Samuel was assigned to the escort detail, one of 20 soldiers who would march the prisoners from the barracks to the scaffold. As they approached the stone building, he could hear something unexpected, singing. The sound was unlike anything Samuel had ever heard, not a church hymn or a military march, but something older, more primal. The Dakota prisoners had begun to sing together, their voices rising and falling in harmony. Words Samuel didn't understand, but whose emotional weight was unmistakable. It wasn't a song of despair or pleading. It was a song of defiance and memory, of dignity reclaimed in the face of annihilation. Captain Redmond stood outside the barracks, his face unreadable. "They started about an hour ago," he said quietly. "Haven't stopped since." Should we silence them, sir?" asked Lieutenant Marsh, a young officer eager to prove himself. "No," Redmond said. "Let them sing. They'll be silent soon enough." Samuel felt something break inside him at those words, though he couldn't have named what it was. The captain was right, of course. In less than an hour, these voices would be stilled forever. But the casual acceptance of that fact, the inevitability of it, felt like a kind of damnation, not just for the condemned, but for those who condemned them. The doors opened. The prisoners emerged in a single file line, still shackled but walking upright, their voices never faltering. Wikangapi led them, his grey hair streaming in the morning wind, his voice clear and strong despite his age. Behind him came warriors, hunters, fathers, sons, men who'd been judged and condemned in trials that rarely lasted more than 5 minutes, with evidence often based on hearsay and confusion. The song they sang was called the Dakota Death Song, though that translation didn't capture its full meaning. It was a song of journey, of transition from one world to another. It spoke of ancestors waiting to receive them, of the eternal cycle of life and death, of courage in the face of the unknown. It was deeply personal and profoundly communal, binding the 38 men together in their final moments. The townspeople fell silent as the procession passed. Some looked triumphant, vindicated by this display of official justice. Others looked away, uncomfortable with the singing, with the prisoner's dignity, with the reality of what was about to happen. A few women began to weep, though whether from satisfaction or sorrow Samuel couldn't tell. Samuel marched beside the line, his rifle at his shoulder, his heart pounding. He looked at the faces of the condemned men and saw fear, yes, but also something unexpected, peace. They'd made their choice to sing, to face death on their own terms, and that choice had transformed them from victims into something else, something the crowd couldn't easily categorize or dismiss. As they walked through Mankato's streets toward the square, Samuel noticed details that would haunt him forever. The way standing buffalo's shackles had worn raw spots on his ankles, the trembling of young Changtewashtewing's hands despite his steady voice, the serenity on Wikangapi's face, as if he'd already left this world and was merely waiting for his body to follow. The procession moved slowly, giving the crowd time to gather, giving the condemned men time to look one last time at the winter sky, the frozen river, the land that had been their home and would now be their grave. Some of the prisoners looked straight ahead, refusing to acknowledge the watching townspeople. Others looked directly at the crowd, their gazes steady and unflinching, as if memorizing faces, bearing witness to their own witnesses. The procession reached the square as the town clock struck 9:30. The condemned men were led up the scaffold steps one by one, positioned beneath the waiting nooses. The singing continued, unbroken, as hangmen placed white hoods over their heads and adjusted the ropes around their necks. The hoods muffled the sound slightly, but the song remained, 38 voices united in a language most present couldn't understand, but whose meaning was becoming clear. Samuel stood at attention at the base of the scaffold, part of the military cordon keeping the crowd at a safe distance. He forced himself to look up at the hooded figures, to not turn away from what his presence sanctioned. This was duty, he'd been told. This was justice for the settlers who died. But standing here, listening to men sing their way to death, he felt the words ring hollow. "They're savages!" a man near Samuel muttered to his companion. "Listen to that heathen noise." But his companion, an older settler with weathered hands and tired eyes, shook his head slowly. "That's not savagery. That's—" He trailed off, unable or unwilling to finish the thought. What he couldn't articulate was this: the song was profoundly human. It spoke to something fundamental about what it meant to face death with consciousness and choice, to refuse victimhood even when power was utterly asymmetric. The Dakota men on that scaffold had no weapons, no leverage, no hope of reprieve, but they had their voices, their solidarity, and their dignity, and they wielded these with a courage that unsettled those who'd expected them to die begging or broken. Captain Redmond climbed the scaffold steps and read the official order in a loud, clear voice. By order of President Abraham Lincoln and the authority of the United States Army, these 38 Dakota men have been found guilty of murder and participation in the outrages committed during the late Dakota Uprising. The sentence is death by hanging, to be carried out immediately. The singing grew louder, more insistent. Some of the hooded men reached out blindly until they found each other's hands, holding on as the final seconds ticked away. Wikangpi's voice rose above the others, not in volume, but in clarity, a melody that seemed to carry across the frozen river and out into the winter landscape beyond. A minister approached the scaffold and began reading a Christian prayer. His voice was respectful but mechanical, words recited by rote. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters." The Dakota song continued beneath it, the two sounds creating a strange, discordant harmony that seemed to embody the conflict itself. Two worlds, two understandings of the divine, meeting at the point of death. The minister's prayer spoke of Jesus and salvation, of sin and redemption through Christian faith. The Dakota song spoke of ancestors and the spirit world, of honor and courage, of continuing cycles that transcended individual death. Neither acknowledged the other, yet both filled the cold morning air with competing visions of what lay beyond. Samuel's hands tightened on his rifle. He thought of his father's farm in Pennsylvania, of spring planting and autumn harvests, of a life that seemed impossibly distant now. He thought of the Dakota families who'd lived on this land for generations, who'd hunted these forests and fished these rivers long before white settlers arrived, with their plows and treaties and promises. He thought of the violence on both sides, the murders and retributions, the spiral of hatred that had led to this moment. And he thought of Wikangpi, standing somewhere in that line of hooded figures, singing a song of his people one final time. Samuel wanted to call out, to say something, though he didn't know what. An apology, an acknowledgement, some word that would bridge the vast gulf between them. But his throat was closed, his voice locked behind duty and protocol, and the terrible knowledge that anything he said would be meaningless in the face of what was about to happen. The crowd had swelled to over 4,000 people, nearly the entire population of Mankato and the surrounding area. They pressed against the military cordon, craning their necks for a better view. Some had brought children who sat on their fathers' shoulders. Vendors moved through the crowd, selling hot coffee and bread, treating the execution like a public festival. The normalcy of it, the commerce, the casual conversations, the children playing at the edges of the crowd, made Samuel's stomach turn. The hangman positioned himself at the lever. He was a professional, brought in from another state because no one in Mankato wanted the job. His face was impassive, revealing nothing of what he felt about dropping 38 men to their deaths. Perhaps he felt nothing. Perhaps this was simply work to him, a task to be performed with efficiency and precision. The crowd grew silent, even those who'd come eager for vengeance now subdued by the reality before them. The singing reached a crescendo, 38 voices calling out to ancestors, to spirits, to a world beyond the one that had condemned them. Some voices were strong and steady, others wavered with fear or emotion, but all remained united in the song, bound together in their final act of communal resistance. Captain Redmond raised his hand. Time seemed to slow, each second stretching into something elastic and terrible. The Dakota song held strong, no wavering, no breaking, just men facing death with the only weapon left to them, their voices, their unity, their refusal to die in silence. Samuel could see the hangman's hand on the lever. He could see the hooded figures standing perfectly still now, their singing the only movement, their joined hands the only connection. He could see the crowd holding its collective breath, thousands of people witnessing something they would never forget, something that would mark them and this place forever. In that suspended moment, Samuel understood something that would take him years to articulate. They were all complicit. Every person in that square, soldier and civilian, supporter and skeptic, active participant and passive witness, bore responsibility for what was about to happen. The decision had been made in courtrooms and presidential offices, but it was being executed here, in public, with the town's full knowledge and the law's full sanction. This was not hidden violence or secret cruelty. This was official, sanctioned, proud, and that made it somehow worse. The hand dropped, the lever was pulled, the trapdoors fell open with a tremendous crack that echoed across the square like thunder or cannon fire or the sound of the world breaking. 38 bodies dropped simultaneously, the ropes snapping taut with sounds Samuel would hear in his nightmares for the rest of his life. The singing stopped, not all at once, but in a staggered, horrible way as men died at different speeds, some instantly, others struggling for agonizing seconds that felt like eternities. The crowd remained silent. No cheers, no celebration. Even those who demanded this execution seemed shaken by its reality. Several women turned away, pressing handkerchiefs to their faces. Men who'd arrived with angry satisfaction now stood with troubled expressions, as if realizing they'd witnessed something that would mark them forever. The bodies swayed gently in the winter wind, turning slowly on their ropes. The white hoods made them anonymous, stripping away their individual identities and reducing them to uniform symbols of conquest and punishment. But Samuel knew who they were. He knew that one of those hooded figures was Wikangpi, who'd counseled peace. Another was young Changtewashtewing, who'd been a hunter. Another was Standing Buffalo, who'd fought believing he defended his people. Samuel stood frozen, his eyes locked on the swaying bodies. His chest felt tight, his breathing shallow. This was justice, he'd been told. This was necessary, required, the price of civilization. But looking at those hooded figures, turning slowly in the winter wind, he felt only a vast, crushing weight of something he couldn't name. Not quite guilt, not quite horror, but something between them. Something that made his hands shake and his vision blur. A child's voice broke the silence. "Mama, are they sleeping?" "Hush," the mother replied, her voice thick with emotion. "Don't look." But the child kept staring, as children do when they sense adults are hiding something important. Samuel wondered what that child would remember of this day, what story they would tell themselves about what they'd witnessed. Would they remember the singing? Would they understand that the hooded figures had been human beings with names and families? Or would they absorb the lesson the execution was meant to teach, that this is what happens to those who resist, who fight back, who refuse to disappear quietly? "Dismissed!" Captain Redmond called out, his voice rougher than usual. "Back to your posts." The soldiers began to disperse, but Samuel couldn't move. He stood rooted to the spot, staring up at the scaffold, at the bodies that would hang there for hours as a warning, a spectacle, a statement about power and its exercise. "Private Hartley," Redmond's voice was closer now, gentler. "You did your duty. Move along." Samuel finally tore his gaze away and looked at his captain. Redmond's face was pale beneath his beard, his eyes reflecting something Samuel had never seen there before. Doubt, perhaps, or recognition that duty and righteousness were not always aligned. "Was it right, sir?" Samuel asked, his voice barely a whisper. Redmond was silent for a long moment. Around them, the crowd had begun to disperse, returning to their homes and businesses, resuming their lives as if they hadn't just witnessed mass execution. The ordinary resuming after the extraordinary, the mundane reasserting itself over the horrific. "It was legal, Private," Redmond finally said. "Whether that's the same as right?" He trailed off, then shook his head. "That's above our pay grade. We follow orders. That's what soldiers do." "Nduv," But as Samuel walked away from the scaffold, past the dispersing crowd, and toward the barracks where he'd spend another night on guard duty, he knew that some questions couldn't be answered by appeals to authority. Some questions followed you, persistent and uncomfortable, refusing to accept easy answers or convenient hierarchies of responsibility. 3 days after the execution, Samuel sat in the barracks writing a letter home. Outside, a snowstorm had buried Mankato in white, transforming the town into a landscape of muffled sound and obscured horizons. The scaffold had been dismantled, the bodies removed and buried in a mass grave on the outskirts of town. But the memory remained, sharp and undiminished. He'd tried several times to write to his parents, to explain what he'd witnessed, but the words came out wrong. Too stark or too evasive, never capturing the complexity of what he felt. The paper before him was covered in false starts, crossed-out sentences, attempts at articulation that collapsed under the weight of what they tried to describe. Finally, he simply wrote the truth. Dear Mother and Father, I witnessed something this week that I cannot fully explain. 38 men were hanged for their part in the Dakota Uprising. I was assigned to guard them in their final hours and to escort them to their execution. They sang as they died, not in fear, but in defiance and dignity. I do not know if they were all guilty of the crimes charged against them. Some were, certainly, but some may have been innocent, condemned in trials too brief to separate truth from confusion. The townspeople here speak of justice served, of debts paid in blood. But I cannot shake the feeling that we have done something terrible, something that will echo far beyond this moment. The singing haunts me. It was the sound of men refusing to die as criminals, choosing instead to die as themselves, as Dakota, as human beings, with names and stories and loves. I'm not sure what this war has made of me, or what this country is making of itself. We speak of civilization and progress while building scaffolds that can hang dozens of men at once. We speak of justice while condemning men in trials that last mere minutes. I do not have answers, only questions that grow heavier each day. The captain says we were following orders, that the execution was legal and therefore necessary, but I have learned that legality and morality are not the same thing. The law said these men should die, but does that make their deaths just? Does that erase the questions about whether they were all truly guilty? Does that justify the brevity of their trials, the absence of defense counsel, the rush to judgment driven by townspeople's rage? I will do my duty, I will follow orders, but I will also remember those voices rising together in that frozen dawn. They sang of something we have lost, or perhaps never had, a way of living that honors the land and each other, that understands death as part of life rather than its negation. I do not know when I will see you again. The war continues, and my enlistment has years remaining. But know that I think of home, of the farm, of simpler times when right and wrong seemed clearer than they do now. I think of the lessons you taught me about treating all people with dignity and respect, and I wonder how to reconcile those lessons with what I have witnessed here. The Dakota people are being removed from Minnesota entirely, forced onto reservations in the Dakota Territory where the land is poor and the prospects uncertain. The settlers whose families were killed in the uprising feel this is just, that the Dakota forfeited their right to this land through violence. But the Dakota say they were driven to desperation by starvation and broken promises, that they fought not from savagery, but from the same instinct to protect their families that any of us would feel. I do not know who is right. Perhaps both sides have justice on their side, or perhaps the very concept of justice becomes meaningless in situations like this, where historical wrongs pile upon each other until the original causes are buried beneath layers of retribution and counter-retribution. What I know is this: I watched 38 men die, and they died singing. That song will follow me for the rest of my life. It asks me questions I cannot answer, demands of me a reckoning I do not know how to provide. Your son, Samuel. He sealed the letter and set it aside, then lay back on his bunk and closed his eyes. In the darkness behind his eyelids, he saw the scaffold again, heard the singing again, felt the weight of witness settling into his bones like cold into winter ground. Corporal Hayes sat nearby, cleaning his rifle with methodical precision. Without looking up, he said quietly, "It doesn't get easier, Private." Remembering. "No, sir," Samuel replied. "Good," Hayes said. "The day it gets easy is the day you've lost something important. The day you can watch men die and feel nothing is the day you've become the thing we're supposed to be fighting against." Samuel opened his eyes and looked at the corporal. Hayes was perhaps 35, old for his rank, with the weathered face of someone who'd seen considerable service. He'd been at the Mexican War, Samuel knew, and had fought in several Indian conflicts before Minnesota. "Do you think they were all guilty, Corporal?" Samuel asked. Hayes continued cleaning his rifle, his movements steady and practiced. "I think some were and some weren't. I think the trials were too fast and too angry to sort out which was which. I think we hanged men who deserved it and men who didn't, and we'll never know for certain which was which. Then how do we live with it?" Hayes looked up at him then, his eyes sad and knowing. "We don't. Not comfortably. We carry it. We remember it. We try to do better next time, though history suggests we probably won't. Men aren't good at learning from their mistakes, Private. Especially when those mistakes are collective, sanctioned by authority, and wrapped in the language of necessity and justice." Over the following weeks, life in Mankato returned to its wartime rhythms. The remaining Dakota people in Minnesota were forcibly removed to reservations in the Dakota Territory, their land officially confiscated by the federal government. Some died on the journey, particularly the elderly and young children, unable to withstand the harsh winter conditions and inadequate provisions. The settlers who'd lost family members tried to rebuild, carrying their grief and rage like stones in their pockets, finding comfort in the belief that justice had been served even as their nightmares persisted. The soldiers received new assignments, new orders, new duties that carried them away from Mankato and toward other conflicts. The war back east continued its grinding course, consuming young men and spitting out corpses and casualties in quantities that made even the Dakota War seem small by comparison. But the story of the 38 men who sang before they died spread through whispered conversations and written accounts. Newspapers reported it with varying degrees of accuracy and interpretation. Some called it propaganda, an attempt to humanize savages who deserved no sympathy. Others recognized it as something more complex, evidence that even in humanity's darkest moments, dignity could survive, that the powerless could still claim agency in how they faced their end. Samuel heard the stories evolve and distort as they passed from person to person. Some said the Dakota had sung war songs, threatening vengeance from beyond the grave. Others claimed they'd begged for mercy in their final moments, that the singing was a misremembered detail, added later for dramatic effect. A few got it right, that the condemned had sung their death song, facing their end with courage and solidarity, refusing to give their executioners the satisfaction of seeing them die in fear. He tried to correct the false versions when he heard them, but found that people believed what they wanted to believe. The story became a mirror, reflecting back whatever the listener needed to see, savagery or dignity, justice or atrocity, depending on which version of the world they inhabited. Months passed. Samuel was transferred to a fort in the Dakota Territory, where he spent long nights on watch under stars that seemed impossibly distant and indifferent. He thought often of that December morning, of the singing that had risen like smoke into the cold air, of the sound of trapdoors falling and ropes snapping taut. He wondered about the families of the executed men, the wives and children and parents who'd been forcibly relocated, who'd lost not only their land, but their loved ones. Did they sing the same death song in remembrance? Did they pass down the names of the 38 so their children and grandchildren would know who had died and why? Or did the grief swallow the memory, making it too painful to preserve? He wondered too about the townspeople of Mankato. Did they sleep soundly, satisfied that justice had been served? Or did some of them lie awake at night hearing echoes of that song, wondering if they'd witnessed execution or murder, justice or atrocity? Years later, when the Civil War had ended and Samuel had returned to Pennsylvania to work his father's farm, he would sometimes pause in his work and remember that December morning. The memory never faded, never softened into nostalgia or abstraction. It remained sharp and immediate, a wound that wouldn't fully heal. He'd learned that Weekankpi's name meant star, a light in darkness, a guide for those lost in night. He thought of that often, of a man who'd counseled peace and died as a warrior, who'd sung not of vengeance, but of continuity, of a people who would survive even after 38 of their men swung from ropes in a Minnesota town square. The execution had been legal, sanctioned by the highest authority in the land. President Lincoln had reviewed each case personally, spending hours reading through trial transcripts and evidence summaries. He'd reduced the condemned from over 300 to 38 in an act considered merciful by some and treasonously lenient by others. Minnesota politicians had pressured him to approve all 300 executions, warning that settlers would take matters into their own hands if the government seemed weak. Lincoln had tried to balance justice with political necessity, legality with mercy. But Samuel had learned that legality and justice were not always the same thing. Lincoln had done his best within a system designed for speed rather than accuracy, for punishment rather than understanding. The president had saved 265 men from execution, which was something. But he'd also approved the hanging of 38 men, some of whom were almost certainly innocent of the specific crimes charged against them. Samuel married a quiet woman named Elizabeth, who asked few questions about his time in Minnesota. They had 3 children, 2 daughters and a son. He never told them about the execution, couldn't find words to explain what he'd witnessed. But sometimes his eldest daughter would find him staring out the window on winter mornings, lost in memory, and she'd wonder what he saw in the falling snow that made his eyes so sad. He'd also learned that bearing witness had a cost. He would carry those hooded figures with him always, hear that song in quiet moments, feel the weight of his rifle and his uniform and his complicity in something that history might judge harshly. But he would also carry forward a lesson learned in blood and snow, that humanity persists even in dehumanization's shadow, that dignity cannot be destroyed even when lives are taken, that the songs we sing in our darkest hours are the truest expression of who we are. On December 26, 1862, 38 Dakota men were hanged in Mankato, Minnesota, in the largest mass execution in American history. Their names were largely forgotten by the white world that condemned them, their stories reduced to footnotes in textbooks that framed their deaths as unfortunate necessities of nation-building and westward expansion. The execution was justified as punishment for the uprising, as deterrence against future resistance, as the price of civilization's advance across the continent. But among the Dakota people, scattered across reservations and forced into new territories far from their homeland, they were remembered, not as criminals or savages, but as men who faced death with courage, who sang their way into the next world, who refused to let their executioners have the final word. Their names were spoken in ceremonies and passed down through generations. The song they sang on the scaffold was remembered and taught to children, a reminder of dignity in the face of overwhelming power, of resistance that transcended physical survival. Samuel Hartley lived to be 73 years old. He married, raised children, saw the century turn, and new technologies transformed the world he'd grown up in. He witnessed the final closing of the frontier, the end of the Indian Wars, the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, the rise of industrial America. He read newspaper accounts of new conflicts and new justifications for violence, and he recognized in them the same patterns he'd seen in Minnesota. Power asserting itself through law, violence sanctioned by official procedure, atrocity disguised as necessity. But on winter mornings, when the world was silent and snow fell like memory over Pennsylvania hills, he would stand at his window and listen to a sound only he could hear. 38 voices singing together, rising above the frozen Minnesota landscape, refusing to be silenced even by death. It was the sound of men choosing how they would be remembered. It was the sound of dignity in the face of annihilation. It was the sound of a wound that would never fully heal, a debt that could never be repaid, a question that would echo through American history long after the scaffold was dismantled and the bodies were buried and the town of Mankato returned to the business of forgetting. But some things refuse to be forgotten. Some songs, once sung, never truly end. They echo forward, carried by those who heard them, preserved in the memories of witnesses who cannot turn away from what they've seen. And in that echoing, in that refusal to forget, lies both the tragedy and the faint, fragile hope that perhaps someday we might learn from the voices we've silenced, might honor the dignity we've tried to destroy, might build a justice that doesn't require scaffolds, that can hang 38 men at once. The wind over the Minnesota prairie still carries their song, if you listen closely enough. It carries their names, their stories, their humanity. It carries the question that Samuel Hartley asked his captain on that frozen December morning, the question that remains unanswered across the decades and centuries. Was it right? History provides no simple answer. The execution was legal but brutal, sanctioned but questionable, official but haunting. It satisfied the demand for vengeance, but raised uncomfortable questions about the nature of justice, the speed of military tribunals, the treatment of conquered peoples, and the price of building a nation on violence and displacement. But it offers us the voices of those who sang, the memory of those who witnessed, and the responsibility to remember that behind every statistic, every historical footnote, every legal execution, there are human beings with names and faces and songs that deserve to be heard. This is their story. This is Samuel's story. This is America's story. Complicated, painful, and desperately in need of honest witness. May we listen to the songs we've tried to silence. May we remember the names we've tried to forget. May we build a future worthy of those who sang in the face of death, choosing dignity over despair, unity over isolation, humanity over the machinery of state-sanctioned violence. The 38 sang. We must remember their song. Not to condemn those who carried out the execution. They were products of their time, following orders in a system that valued expedience over careful deliberation. Not to excuse the violence of the Dakota War. Settlers had died, families had suffered, and that suffering was real and terrible. But to remember that in the middle of conflict and retribution, 38 men faced death with courage and solidarity, that they claimed dignity when it should have been impossible, that they sang when silence would have been easier. Their song reminds us that humanity persists in the darkest places, that the powerless are never entirely without agency, that how we face death reveals who we truly are. It reminds us to question authority when authority demands we stop asking questions, to doubt justice that moves too quickly to be careful, to resist the machinery of state violence even when that machinery operates with legal sanction and popular support. The execution at Mankato was history's largest mass hanging in America. It was also a moment when 38 men, facing overwhelming power and certain death, chose to sing. That choice echoes forward, asking us to remember, to question, to build something better than the world that built a scaffold large enough to hang 38 men at once. Listen carefully. The song continues. It has never stopped.